I have set bones and closed the eyes of better men than this county ever deserved. And in 51 years of doctoring the dusty stretch of Kansas we called Kettle Springs, I thought I had grown a hide too thick to be moved. Then came the summer the widow stood in the white noon heat with her baby against her shoulder, and every door on Main Street shut at her back. And I learned I had been wrong about my own heart and wrong about Sela's wards, both in the space of a single afternoon. You have to understand the heat of that year to understand any of it. It came down on the plains like a lid on a kettle and never lifted. The creeks ran to cracked mud. The wheat stood scorched in the fields, and men who had never prayed in their lives took off their hats in the church at Kettle Springs and asked for rain that did not come. In weather like that a town turns hard. It pulls in on itself the way a hand closes into a fist, and it has no room left over for a stranger with nothing in her purse. She came in on the freight wagon from the east, and I remember the day because I had been called out to the depot for a teamster who'd crushed his thumb loading crates. I was wrapping the thumb when the wagon rolled in, and I saw her climb down from the seat with a bundle in her arms and set her one small trunk in the dust beside her. She was young, not more than 25, I judged, and she wore a morning dress gone gray at the seams from the road, and she held herself straight in a way that told you she had decided, somewhere back along that trail, that she would not let the world see her bend. The bundle in her arms was a baby, a little girl, I'd learn, no more than 4 months old, with a fever coming up in her that I could read from 10 feet off by the flush in the child's cheeks and the fret in the small clenched fists. The mother did not know yet that the fever was there. She was too busy counting her coins. I watched her count them twice at the depot window, the whole of what she had, and I watched the ticket agent shake his head, and I watched her face not change at all. That was the thing that struck me. Her face did not change. She only nodded once as if the answer had merely confirmed something she'd long suspected, and she gathered up the child in the trunk and walked into town to try the boarding house. Her name was Marin Ashcroft, and this is as much of her story as she ever told me plain. She had married a man named Thomas Ashcroft back in Ohio, a good man by every account, a man who had wanted land of his own out west the way some men want salvation. They had started the journey with a wagon and a milk cow and every hope 2 people can carry between them. Somewhere past the Missouri the fever took him. Not the baby's fever, the trail fever, the kind that empties a wagon train 2 souls at a time. And it took the cow soon after, and it took the wagon when she had to sell it for the burying and the food. And by the time she reached Kettle Springs on the freight seat she had her daughter, her trunk, her wedding ring, and $11, and the plain stretched out empty in every direction like the inside of an unanswered prayer. I know all that now. That first day I knew none of it. I only knew a young woman in a worn black dress was walking up Main Street with a sick baby and a look on her face like a woman walking into a wind. And something in me, the doctor in me, I suppose, that never does learn to look away, followed her at a distance to see how the town would use her. The town used her the way a hard town uses anyone who arrives with empty hands in a lean year. Mrs. Odell kept the boarding house then, a narrow-eyed woman who could smell a light purse through a plank wall, and she stood in her own doorway with her arms folded and looked Marin Ashcroft up and down, and named a price for a room that I knew for a fact was double what she charged the drummers who came through selling patent tonics. Marin counted her coins a 3rd time. She offered what she had. Mrs. Odell shook her head and said the room went by the week, paid ahead, and there was no charity in Kettle Springs for women who couldn't say plainly where their husbands were. "My husband is dead," Marin said. Her voice was low and even. "He died on the trail. I have his ring and his name and his daughter, and I will pay you honest work for a bed if you have no charity. I did not ask for charity." But the word husband, spoken by a young woman alone with a baby and no money, does a peculiar thing in a small town. It does not open doors. It sets tongues going. By the time Marin had tried the second boarding house in the back room over the Mercantile and the widow Pratt who was said to take in girls in trouble, the story had run up and down Main Street ahead of her and come back changed, the way stories do, and what came back was not a widow but a warning. A woman with a baby and no man. Money troubles. Wouldn't say where she came from. You know the kind. The good women of Kettle Springs drew their skirts in. The men looked once and looked away, because looking too long at a young widow is its own kind of danger to a man standing. And door after door shut, some of them soft and some of them hard, until by the high white heat of noon Marin Ashcroft stood at the end of Main Street with nowhere left to try, and the baby beginning now to cry that thin, exhausted cry that a sick child cries when even crying has worn it out. I had made up my mind to go to her. I want that on the record, for what my own conscience is worth. I had made up my mind. An old widowed doctor is about the safest man in a town for a stranded woman to be seen with, and I meant to walk over and at least look at that baby, whatever the biddies made of it. But before I could cross the street, Silas Ward came out of the Mercantile. Now I have to stop and tell you about Silas, because if you did not know him, you will not believe what happened, and if you did know him, you will believe it even less. Silas Ward ran the finest cattle operation in 3 counties out on Cinch Creek, and he ran it alone, and he was, by the general agreement of every soul in Kettle Springs, the hardest man any of us had ever met. He was somewhere past 40 then, and had never married and never courted and never, that anyone could recall, spoken a soft word to a living creature that wasn't a horse. He paid his hands fair and worked them harder than any outfit in the state, and he paid his debts to the penny on the day they came due and never a day sooner. And he had once ridden 40 miles in a blizzard to return a strayed steer that wasn't even his brand because he would not have it said that a Ward kept what wasn't his. And in the same winter, he had turned a drifter off his porch into that same blizzard, because the man had lied to him about being able to shoe a horse. Fair they called him when they were being kind, cold when they weren't, closed-fisted, the meanest generous man in Kansas, my late wife used to say, which was as near to the truth of Silas Ward as anyone ever got. I was one of the few who knew the reason, and I only knew it because I had been the doctor called out to Cinch Creek 20 years before, when the Ward boys were young and both their folks were dead, and it was just the 2 of them running that place, Silas, grown, and his little brother Danny, 17 and wild as a spring colt. Danny drowned in Cinch Creek in the flood of a wet April, gone down trying to pull a bogged calf out of the water because Silas had told him to save the stock, and Silas had gone in after him and hauled his brother's body out with his own hands, and I was the one who came and could do nothing but sign the paper. Silas Ward never spoke Danny's name again to me or to anyone. He just closed up around the loss the way flesh closes around a bullet it cannot spit out, and the hardness we all knew grew over that wound like scar tissue, thick and dead to the touch. A man who has once failed to save the one soul he loved will sometimes decide, without ever saying so, that the safest thing is to love nothing further. That was Silas. That was the whole of him, or so I believed until that noon. He came out of the Mercantile with a 50-pound sack of flour on his shoulder and his supply list in his fist, in no more hurry than a stone is in, and he stopped dead on the boardwalk. He was looking at Marin. The whole street was looking at Marin by then, sideways, the way you look at a thing you've decided not to help. But Silas looked straight on, the way he looked at everything, and I watched his eyes go from the woman straight back to the worn black dress to the crying baby, and I watched something happen in his face that I had not seen happen in 20 years. It was very small. It was only that his jaw, which was always set harder, and then strangely loosened, as if a door somewhere behind his ribs, one that had rusted shut, had been struck a single blow and shifted on its hinge. He set the flour down on the boardwalk. He walked across the street in that unhurried way of his, and the town watched him the way it would have watched a wolf walk down Main Street at noon, and he stopped in front of the widow and took off his hat. I was close enough now to hear it. "Ma'am," Silas said, "that child is sick." Marin lifted her chin. I think she had braced for another price named too high, another door, and a plain statement of fact from a hard-looking stranger caught her without her armor. "She has a fever," Marin said. "It came up on the road. I have money for the doctor. I don't have money for much else, but I have money for the doctor, and I'll thank you not to think otherwise." "I didn't think otherwise," Silas said. And I have turned this over 1,000 times, how a man that hard found the one true thing to say to a woman that proud. He did not offer her charity. He did not offer her pity, which she would have thrown back in his face. He said, "My cook quit in the spring, and I've eaten my own poor cooking since. My house wants keeping, and I haven't the time nor the talent. It's honest work, hard work, out on Cinch Creek, and it pays a fair wage and board, a roof, a room of your own, and the child's keep. I'm no hand with a baby, but I've a warm, dry house and a good well, which is more than that fever wants. You'd be doing me a service." He turned his hat once in his hands. "It's a position, ma'am, not a kindness. I don't deal in kindness." He was lying about the last part, of course. He dealt in nothing else his whole life. He only ever called it something harder so a proud person could take it. But Marin Ashcroft could not have known that yet, and the beauty of it was that she did not have to. He had handed her away to say yes that cost her no dignity at all, not a rescue, not alms, but a wage for work. And I saw her understand it, and I saw her weigh it, this hard-faced stranger and his offer, against the shut doors behind her and the fever in her arms. "I keep a careful ledger," she said at last, which was not yes and was not no. "I'll want the wage set plain, and I'll not take a cent more than the work is worth, and if the work isn't worth the wage I'll say so myself and we'll settle it fair." "I'd expect nothing less," Silas said. "And I'll pay you back the doctor's fee out of the first wages if you're of a mind to front it, though I'd rather pay my own." "Pay your own, then," said Silas, who I happened to know later paid me the fee himself the next time he was in town and forbade me to tell her, and I never did, until now. That was how it began. I looked at the baby that afternoon in the back room of my surgery. A summer fever, bad but not the worst. The kind that clean water and shade and a cool cloth and someone who does not sleep will pull a child through. And I told Marin as much. And I told Silas as much. And Silas nodded once and picked up the trunk that the town had watched sit in the dust all morning and carried it out to his wagon like it weighed nothing. And he drove the widow and her sick baby out the long road to Cinch Creek, while the good women of Kettle Springs watched from behind their curtains and found in this one more thing to talk about. I did not expect it to last a fortnight. I'll be honest as a man ought to be about his own poor guessing. I thought the hard man would find a proud woman underfoot in his silent house, and the arrangement would fray, and I'd be driving out to fetch her back to town inside 2 weeks. I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. What I know of that first month I know partly from my own visits. I drove out 3 times to see the baby through the fever, and watched it break on the 9th day, watched little Pearl Ashcroft come back to herself pink and squalling and furious with health, and partly from Silas's hired hand, a decent talkative young fellow named Cole who could not for the life of him keep from telling me every wonder he saw. And there were wonders. Marin Ashcroft, it turned out, was worth 3 of any cook Silas had ever hired. She had grown up on a hard farm and married a poor man and learned to make a great deal out of a little, and she took that silent, dusty ranch house that had not known a woman's hand in 20 years, and by the end of the first week it smelled of bread. By the end of the second, Cole said, the hands were finding excuses to eat at the big house that had never eaten anywhere but the bunkhouse. She kept her ledger the way she'd promised, every egg and every sack of meal set down in a neat small hand, and once a week she brought the book to Silas at the kitchen table and made him look at it and account for every cent. And he, who accounted his own affairs down to the penny and trusted no man's figures but his own, sat there of an evening and let this widow show him her columns. And Cole swore that the hardest man in Kansas, looked at those tidy rows of numbers, the way another man might look at a sunset. But it was Pearl who did the real work. It is always the small ones who do the real work. I have seen it 100 times and it never fails to gladden me. That baby knew nothing of Silas Ward's reputation. She did not know he was hard. She only knew he was warm and large and steady, and babies go toward warmth the way seedlings go toward light, and there was not one thing the man could do about it. Cole told me, laughing, and then not laughing, how he'd come up to the house at dusk one evening for the count and found no one in the yard, and gone quiet to the window, and seen Silas Ward sitting alone in the kitchen in the last of the light with that baby asleep on his chest, one enormous scarred rancher's hand spread across her back to hold her there, and Silas not moving, not making a sound, hardly breathing, for fear of waking her. A man who had decided 20 years before to love nothing further, undone by 4 months of Pearl Ashcroft, who could not even hold up her own head. He would not have called it that. If you had said the word love to Silas Ward that summer, he'd have looked at you like you'd spoken Chinese. But I have watched men my whole doctoring life, and I know the shape of a heart coming back to life, whether the man owns to it or not. It is a painful thing to watch, truly more painful than a break setting, because a heart that is scarred over a loss does not soften without the old wound waking too, and Silas's wound woke that summer. Cole was there the night it woke. He told me about it later, ashamed to be telling it because it was a private thing. Cinch Creek came up in a hard rain in the middle of August, the first real weather of that dry year, 3 days of it, the creek that had run to mud rising brown and fast between its banks, and a calf got bogged in the flood the same as calves have gotten bogged since the first cow, and Cole started for it. And Silas came out of the house white as a sheet and shouting at Cole to let the calf go. Let it go. No beast on this earth was worth a man's neck. And Cole had never in his life heard Silas Ward raise his voice and stood there stunned in the rain while a $50 calf drowned. And Silas Ward stood on the bank shaking, staring at the water, seeing something in it that had happened 20 years before. Marin came out into the rain with a coat over her head. Cole started to explain the calf, the flood, the boss gone strange, but she took one look at Silas's face and she did not ask a single question. She just went and stood beside him on the bank, close but not touching, the rain coming down on both of them, and after a while, Cole had gone in by then, but he watched from the window, God forgive him. After a while Silas Ward began to talk. Cole couldn't hear the words and wouldn't have repeated them if he could. He only saw the hardest man in the county standing in the flood rain telling a young widow the thing he had not told a living soul in 20 years, and the widow standing steady beside him and letting him tell it, and not once trying to fix it or soften it or hurry him past it, just standing, the way she'd stood at that boarding house door, straight against a wind, until at the end of it Silas put his face in his hands, and Marin Ashcroft, who owed the man everything and knew it, and would not for pride let it make her less than his equal, put one hand flat between his shoulder blades, the same gesture I'd seen him make to hold the baby on his chest, and held him up. That was the turn of it. Not a wedding, not a kiss, nothing the biddies could have named. Just 2 people who had each buried the person they loved most, finding out on a flooded riverbank that they were no longer alone in it. After that night, the arrangement between them was still in name. A wage for honest work, she still brought the ledger. He still made her account for every cent, but it had become the other thing underneath. And everyone at Cinch Creek knew it. And out at the ranch it made a kind of quiet music that the hands warmed themselves at all through that hard summer. The town, of course, told a different story. I don't like to dwell on this part, but it belongs in the account or the account's a lie. Kettle Springs had decided what Marin Ashcroft was on the first day, and a town does not easily give up a thing it has decided, particularly when giving it up would mean admitting it had shut its doors on a decent grieving woman and her sick child in the noon heat. It was easier for some to keep her wicked, and so the whispers that had run up Main Street that first day did not die out, they curdled. A woman living out on a bachelor's ranch. Draw your own conclusions. The good women drew them freely, And the worst of it, I'm sorry to say, came from the church, from Prudence Gantry, who ran the Ladies' Aid the way Silas ran his cattle, and who had a genius for cruelty that dressed itself up as concern. It was Prudence Gantry who saw to it that, when Marin came to town for supplies, she was served last and short-waited. Prudence Gantry who let it be known that certain persons would not be welcome at the harvest social. Prudence Gantry who said, in a voice pitched to Carrie within Marin's hearing at the Mercantile, that some women had no shame and dragged their poor children down into the dirt with them. I was there for that last one. I saw Marin Ashcroft go white, and I saw her hand tighten on the baby, and I saw her open her mouth and then close it, because she had a child in her arms and would not brawl in a store, and she paid for her flour and her thread with her chin up and walked out, and it was only when she reached the wagon that I saw her hands shaking. I went out after her. I'm an old man and a doctor, and I can say what I please to Prudence Gantry, and I meant to. But Marin stopped me with a look. "Don't, Dr. Pryor," she said. "You'll only make it a fight, and I can't win a fight in this town, and it'll go worse for me and worse for Pearl. Let it be." She got the baby settled and climbed up to the seat and gathered the reins, and then she looked down at me and said a thing I have never forgotten. "I know what I am," she said. "I know what my husband was and what my marriage was and what my child is, and I know it clean and true in the sight of God, whatever this town decides to make of it. They can call me what they like, they cannot make it so. My ledger's square, I sleep at night." And she drove out. But I saw her face, and it was not as square as her ledger. A person can know a thing to be false and still bleed from it. The whispers were wearing on her that autumn, and worse, they had begun to reach Cinch Creek, a slur shouted from a passing rig, a coldness from a neighbor's wife at a fence line, and Silas had begun to hear them. And if Kettle Springs had known Silas Ward the way I knew him, it would have been more careful. Because a hard man's tenderness, once you've woken it, does not come alone. It comes with everything else the hardness was holding down. And what Silas Ward's hardness had been holding down, I began to fear, was not only grief. The thing came to its head at the harvest, as such things do. Pearl took a second fever in the last week of September, worse than the first, a deep one in the chest, the kind that takes small children in a hard autumn and does not give them back. Cole rode into town for me at midnight through a cold rain, and I went out to Cinch Creek, and I will not dress it up. For 2 days that baby's life hung by a thread you could have cut with a harsh word. I did what a country doctor could do, which in those years was little enough, and the rest was up to Pearl and to the 2 grown people who did not sleep for 48 hours, who took the child in turns and walked her and cooled her and kept the fire right, and did not once, either of them, say aloud the thing they were both afraid of. I have sat many death watches. I have seen how they strip the paint off people, how in the 3rd sleepless hour a person becomes exactly and only what they are. And what I saw in that ranch house those 2 days was 2 people who loved that child and each other with everything they had and no longer any pretense otherwise. I saw Silas Ward on his knees by a cradle praying Silas, who I'd have sworn had not prayed since he signed his brother's paper. I saw Marin fall asleep at last on her feet from pure exhaustion, and Silas catch her before she struck the floor and carry her to the chair, and take up the watch himself so she could rest. And I saw the look on his face as he held the burning child, and it was not the look of a hired man toward a cook's daughter. It was the look of a father. On the 2nd night the fever broke. I have delivered the news of a broken fever more times than I can count, and it never stops being the finest thing a doctor gets to do. I laid my hand on Pearl's chest and felt the terrible heat gone out of her and felt the small, strong beat of a heart that had decided to stay, and I looked up and I said, "She'll do. She's turned. She'll do," and Marin Ashcroft, who had not wept once through the whole ordeal, wept then. And Silas Ward crossed that room and took her in his arms in front of me and Cole and God and everyone, and held her while she shook, and neither one of them cared in that moment what the world would make of it, because they had come through the fire together and out the far side, and there was no going back to pretending, and no reason to. They were married 3 weeks later. I want to tell you it was a grand thing, but it was Sela's ward and it was a hard year, so it was a plain thing, the circuit preacher, the ranch. A clear cold October morning, Cole and the Hands and myself and my late wife's sister for the woman's side, and Pearl, recovered and fat and furious, in a christening gown that Marin had sat up nights to sew from her own wedding dress, because she said the dress had been happy once and ought to be happy again. It was the finest wedding I ever attended, and there were 9 people at it. But I have not finished, because the town has to come back into it, or the story ends crooked. Here is how the town came back into it. Prudence Gantry had let it be known, you'll remember, that certain persons would not be welcome at the harvest social. The social was held every year in the church hall, the whole county turning out, and it was the one day Kettle Springs put on its better self. That year, it fell the Saturday after the wedding, and everyone expected, Prudence chief among them, that the new Mrs. Ward would have the decency to stay home out on Cinch Creek, where the county's opinion had put her. Silas Ward brought his wife and daughter to the harvest social. He did not do it in anger. That was the thing that broke it. If he had come in swinging, the town could have stayed hard against him, because a town can always harden against a man who comes in swinging. He came in quiet. He drove up in the wagon in his one good coat with his wife beside him in her gray dress, made fresh with a new collar and the baby on her lap in the christening gown. And he handed Marin down and took the baby on his own arm and walked into that church hall the way he walked everywhere, unhurried, like a stone with somewhere to be, and the whole room went silent. And Silas Ward, who in 40-odd years had never made a speech nor wanted to, stood in the doorway with the child on his arm and said, into that silence, in a voice that was not loud but that carried to the last corner of the hall, "This is my wife, Mrs. Marin Ward, and this is my daughter, Pearl Ward. We're new married, and we came to sit with our neighbors if our neighbors will have us. And if any man or woman here has got something to say about my wife, they can say it to me now in the open with their neighbors listening, or they can hold their peace from this day and mean it." He waited. He let the silence sit there and get heavy. "I've lived hard in this county 30 years and paid every debt I ever owed on the day it came due, and never taken one thing that wasn't mine, and never once asked this town for a kindness. I'm not asking now. I'm telling you what's mine. This is my family." That's the whole of it. Nobody said a word to him. Of course, nobody said a word to him. It was Silas Ward, and there was not a man in the county fool enough to say it to his face what he'd whisper behind a curtain. But it was not the men that mattered, and Silas, hard as he was too plain a thinker to have known that. It was the women, and it was Prudence Gantry, and I confess I held my breath. It was old Mrs. Alcott who broke it, as it happened, the doctor's wife's sister, my late wife's own kin, 80 years old and past caring what Prudence Gantry thought of anything. She got up from the bench with her cane and crossed that silent hall and stopped in front of Marin Ward and looked at the baby a long moment. And then she said, loud enough for Prudence to hear, "That is a beautifully made gown. Did you sew it yourself, child?" And Marin, steady, said yes, from her own wedding dress. And old Mrs. Alcott nodded and said, "I thought as much. There's not a hand in this county could do finer. Come sit by me and tell me how you turned the collar, for mine defeats me every time." And she took Marin Ward by the arm and led her to the good bench by the window and sat her down, and that was that. Because a town is not one thing. That is the piece I have learned in 50 years of it. A town is 100 people deciding 100 times a day whether to be their better selves or their worse, and it only takes one old woman with a cane, or one hard rancher in a doorway, or one country doctor who ought to have crossed the street sooner, to make the being better easier than the being worse. Within the hour half, the women in that hall had found some reason to come look at Pearl Ward's christening gown and stayed to talk. And by the end of the afternoon, Marin was trading a bread receipt with the very Odell woman who'd shut the boarding house door in her face, and the two of them acting, in the way of women, as though that door had never been shut at all. Prudence Gantry sat alone at the end of her bench with her mouth pinched up like a drawstring purse, and found at last that cruelty is a poor thing to be left holding when the room has decided to be kind. And within a year she'd moved to her sister's in Wichita, and Kettle Springs did not miss her. I am an old man now, older than Mrs. Alcott was that day, and I have outlived most of the people in this account, which is the hard tax you pay for a long life. Silas Ward is 12 years gone. He died the way he lived, hard and sudden and without complaint, his heart, out in the far pasture in the saddle, which is where he'd have chosen if a man got to choose. Marin buried him next to a stone she'd had set years before at the top of the rise above Cinch Creek, a stone that reads Daniel Ward, the little brother whose name Silas could never speak, because Marin had found the old grief in him and would not let it stay unmarked. She'd made him a place to put it down. She's out there yet, Marin Ward, gray-headed and straight-backed as ever, running that fine ranch with her grandchildren now, and Pearl Ward, who I once carried through 2 fevers, who was the small warm thing that walked the hardest man in Kansas back into his own heart. Pearl is grown and married and has children of her own, and every one of them knows the story of how their grandfather brought their grandmother home, though the town by now tells it soft and proud. The way a town will tell a thing once enough years have gone by to let it forget it ever shut the doors. I tell it plain because I was there, and because I owe the truth to both of them. Every door in that town shut on a widow and her baby in the white noon heat of a hard year, every door but one. And that one belonged to a man the whole county had agreed was too hard to love anyone, a man who had decided over one drowned brother that the safest thing in this world was to keep his hands closed and his heart with them. And it turned out the county was wrong about him, and he was wrong about himself, and the proof of it was a widow too proud to take charity and a baby too small to know she wasn't supposed to, who together got that closed hand open again, finger by finger, a loaf of bread and a squared ledger and a hand held flat against a shaking back, until it was open wide enough to hold a whole family and warm enough to keep them, and it never once closed again. I have signed a great many papers in my time, the sad ones and the glad ones both. But if you were to ask me, old as I am, what the best thing I ever witnessed in this hard and dusty county was, I would not tell you about a life I saved. I would tell you about the afternoon I watched the hardest man in Kansas set a sack of flour down on a boardwalk and cross a street, and take off his hat to a woman the whole town had turned its back on, and say, "That child is sick and mean," underneath it, though he'd not have known the word for it yet. "You are not alone any more, either of you. Come home." He kept the fire lit. The rest of his life he kept it lit.